Hi, and welcome back to Real Brewing with Rofaxon. Today, I'm just going to give you some basic tips about water and yeast. Before I start this, I got to thinking about something. Remember we tasted this Irish red, not quite the right color, a while ago, and I don't know if I mentioned it, it was already poured. It actually had really big head. As you can see, the head has gone down this much. So I'm going to fill it up there a little bit. Okay, so the point is, when I opened it, it just started flowing out of the bottle. And I had to have this glass ready. I don't want that. I want to be able to pop a beer. And if I want to just drink it out of the bottle, I'll drink it out of the bottle. Now, I actually don't like drinking out of the bottle. I think it's better if you pour it in a glass because you get more aroma. But if I want to drink it out of the bottle, I want the carbonation to be such that I can. I used cane sugar because if you remember the first video, I was all out of corn sugar. So I used cane sugar to prime this. Never use cane sugar for anything because that seems to be a major contributing factor to why this is so fizzy. It was still good, it was just too fizzy. Alright, so when I did my demonstration, I kind of showed you all the equipment. And I told you the recipe, which ingredients I used and which ingredients I didn't use. We're going to go into a little bit more depth today about all of the different ingredients. This session is going to be water and yeast, and then we'll do the next ones in the next section. There's a few misnomers about water and brewing. Now, if you brew a beer, it's 90-something% water. It's more water than it is anything else because obviously it's a liquid. So we have this idea that, well, if I want good beer, I'll use bottled water, or I'll use filtered water, or I'll use distilled water. It's not actually the case. You see, for beer to work, and for the yeast to have something to work properly in, you have to have a right pH balance. And I don't remember if you guys want to go back to high school chemistry class, and you've got the scale of pH with 7 in the middle, and then 0 and 14, and you've got the acids and the bases and all of that. A lot of complex chemistry that I don't usually mess with. You want a certain pH for beer. You don't want it to be exactly 7. And that's what happens if you use distilled water. It's exactly in the middle. It's exactly 7. And that doesn't facilitate the use of these enzymes. There's certain chemicals in your water that will facilitate the use of your enzymes and it'll work better. Now, if you're in, let's say you're in town and your water, you turn on the faucet and you smell the chlorine. Or you turn on your faucet and you pour your water out and it's red because there's so much rust in it, or something along those lines. Now, I have very rusty water. Obviously, you turn it on, the water's clear, but if I let it drip in the sink, you're going to have a rust spot. But I still use that for my beer, and because almost all of your water, like 90% of your water, is going to be good enough that you can brew with it. The chemistry is going to be good enough that you can brew with it. So my rule to first-time brewers, unless you cannot drink your water, don't mess with it. Don't change it. Don't buy the chemicals to change the pH, because if you don't know what you're doing, you're just going to make it worse than it was in the first place. If your water is undrinkable, you can't drink it, it smells like sulfur or any number of other things, you would not drink this water. There are places you can go online to find out how to adjust your pH. I'm not going to go into that because I don't adjust my pH. I pull water straight out of the tap. I use well water. That happens to be what my house is on. Everyone I've known who has made good beer, even people who are living in the city, they pull their water straight out of the tap and they don't add anything to mess with the pH. So all I'm going to say is you probably don't need to mess with the pH. You can probably pull your water right out of the tap, but if you're going to mess with the pH, if you're going to adjust your water and add chemicals to your water or use distilled water, make sure you know what you're doing. Do your research, read about it, and everything else. And if you're using distilled water, you are going to have to add certain chemicals to facilitate the use of the enzymes. So just keep that in mind. Alright, so that's it about water. So again, practically what do? I turn the tap on, fill my bucket with water. That's what I do. Let's also hit on yeast real quick in this topic. Yeast is sort of one that I'm still playing with. Yeast range from $2 to $12. And I'm sure there's more expensive yeasts out there than that. There's Cooper's yeast, which I hear good things about, but I've never used, and Nottingham yeast, which I have used. That yeast is $2 a package. You know, that's a great deal. It's only $2. Then there have been some other yeasts that I've used that were close to $9, $10, even $11 a packet. Is there a difference? Well, you have to find out yourself. You know, just trial and error, see what you like. What I like to do is kind of go middle of the road, maybe around a $3 or $4 yeast. But really, all of this Nottingham yeast, which was only $2 a packet that I've used, has always made good beer. So you can probably get away with cheap yeast. And also with yeast, you have another distinction. You have dry yeast and liquid yeast. Dry yeast is not hard to use. It just comes in a little packet, and you open that packet up, and there's a bunch of, it's tan color stuff, and it's yeast, and it's yeast that has gone into its dormant phase. All you have to do with that, and some will say you pitch it in just by sprinkling it over your wort. Personally, I don't like doing that because I'm just afraid, well, what if the yeast went bad? What I usually do is I put in a glass about like this. I fill this glass with warm water and maybe about a tablespoon of sugar, and I stir that up real good, and I add the yeast. Now, the yeast is going to eat the sugar that's in that glass. So you'll notice a head, a lot like the head you have on beer. You'll notice a head forming on top of it, and that means your yeast is alive and it's working. And once it started working in there for maybe 15 minutes, I pitch it in the wort. I stir it up, and that's what I do. Liquid yeast. Don't be discouraged to use liquid yeast because you think it's complicated. On the other hand, I don't really know if it's worth the extra money, but liquid yeast has a nutrient package in the bag. You've got a bag which is, about this thick. You've got this bag. And it's got a nutrient packet in it, and what you do is you just smash it together. That breaks the nutrient package, and then the yeast has something to eat, and it starts growing in your bag, actually swells, to this size. And as soon as it's swollen, now that might take 2 or 3 hours, but as soon as it's swollen, open it up, pour that liquid into your wort, and you've got yeast. If you had a major problem with your beer not starting, the yeast never picked up, maybe you'd use the liquid yeast. If you're after a very specific strain of yeast that you could only find in liquid, maybe you'd use the liquid yeast. But my ultimate thing on yeast is, personally, I use dry yeast. I've always used dry yeast. When I made my mead, when I made my wine, I used dry yeast. I like dry yeast. I think dry yeast works great, and that's what I use. But that's not to say don't use liquid yeast. It's just a little more expensive, but there's a lot of variety there too. But another thing, don't get scared to play with your yeast. If there's a certain yeast that your local homebrew store carries, look it up on the internet. Sometimes they'll say right on the package what it does or what it's good for. Sometimes they'll have a chart in the store. My homebrew store has a chart on the store. Look up what it does. Maybe you've got I know there's a SAF brew, and it's got 30, 58, all these different categories. Maybe, and usually actually, this particular strain of yeast, it'll say is good for an English ale. This particular strain is good for an IPA. So, find out what beer are you making. If you're making an English ale, get a yeast that works for an English ale. Now, if you use the Nottingham at the, $2 base yeast, pretty much it works for everything, so you can use it for everything. But, here's a great idea. Make a recipe with that yeast, and then make a recipe with a liquid yeast, and then make a recipe with a dry yeast, but that's for actually that style. See if you notice a difference. The only thing I would say is if you're going to use something that's not an all-purpose yeast, make sure you're using it for the right brew. If it says this is great for imperial stouts, don't use it for an IPA because you're going to have some weird flavor. But do remember that all your alcohol is actually created by the yeast, and it's going to impart certain flavors to your alcohol. So don't be scared to try different yeast. Just make sure you're doing it for the right style. So, sum it up real quick. I'm out of time here. Sum it up real quick. Water, pull it out of the tap. Yeast, play around with it. Dry yeast is great. All-purpose yeast works. After you've done that a little bit, specialize and get a certain type of yeast, and find your favorite. Find what you like. Well, I think that's all I have for today. And join in next time for grains. All right.